In a small town where the streets were lined with elm trees and the houses sat comfortably beside one another with their neat wooden porches and painted shutters, there lived a woman named Martha who kept a medicine cabinet in her kitchen, just beside the window that looked out onto the garden where herbs grew in orderly rows throughout the warmer months of the year. Every morning, Martha would wake slowly as the light came through the curtains, and she would sit at the edge of her bed for a moment, feeling the coolness of the floorboards beneath her feet before standing and moving toward the washstand where a pitcher of water waited, and she would pour the water into the basin, watching it settle and become still before she touched it with her fingertips, and began her morning routine of washing her face and hands with plain soap that she kept in a small dish. The medicine cabinet had been installed by her husband some years before, and it was a simple wooden box with a glass door that opened on small hinges, and inside there were several shelves where she kept the various remedies and supplies that a household might need from time to time, arranged in a way that made sense to her, with the items used most frequently placed on the middle shelf where they were easiest to reach. On the topmost shelf, there were rolls of clean cotton bandaging that she had purchased from the general store, and these rolls sat next to a small bottle of iodine tincture that had a dark amber color and a distinctive smell that reminded her of the pharmacy where she sometimes went to have prescriptions filled, though most of the time she managed with simpler preparations that could be made at home or purchased without much difficulty. The middle shelf held a jar of petroleum jelly that was useful for minor scrapes and for preventing chapping during the cold winter months, when the wind would blow across the fields and through the town, leaving everyone's skin feeling dry and tight. And beside the petroleum jelly there was a tin of zinc oxide ointment that she applied to small irritations or rashes when they appeared, though such things were not frequent and usually resolved themselves with time and gentle care. There was also a bottle of castor oil, which sat with its cork stopper fitted tightly, and Martha remembered how her own mother had kept castor oil in the house and had occasionally administered it when someone in the family seemed to need it, though Martha herself used it sparingly and only when she felt quite certain it was the right thing to do, measuring it out carefully with a spoon and mixing it with a bit of orange juice to make it more palatable. On the lower shelf, she kept a box of baking soda, which was useful for so many things beyond baking, including mixing with water to make a paste for insect bites, or creating a solution for settling an upset stomach. And she would sometimes add a small amount to bath water when someone had been out in the sun too long and needed something soothing for their skin. Beside the baking soda was a bottle of witch hazel, which had come from the druggist and which Martha used by dabbing a small amount onto a clean cloth and applying it gently to minor bruises or areas of skin that seemed inflamed. And the witch hazel had a clean, slightly astringent smell that she found pleasant and reassuring, and it seemed to help with the small discomforts that arose from time to time in the course of ordinary life. There was a jar of honey as well, which Martha kept in the medicine cabinet rather than in the pantry, because she thought of it as medicinal, particularly during the winter months when throats became scratchy and uncomfortable, and she would dissolve a spoonful of honey in warm water or tea, stirring it slowly and watching the honey swirl and thin and finally disappear into the liquid, creating a drink that soothed and comforted. In one corner of the middle shelf there was a small bottle of peppermint oil, and Martha would sometimes place a single drop of this oil onto a handkerchief when someone had a headache, and the person would hold the handkerchief near their face and breathe in the cool, sharp scent of the peppermint, and often they would report feeling somewhat better after a little while. Though whether this was due to the peppermint or simply to resting quietly was difficult to say. Martha also kept a tin of mustard powder, which she used to make plasters when someone in the household had congestion in their chest, and she would mix the mustard powder with flour and warm water to create a paste, and then she would spread this paste onto a piece of flannel cloth and fold the cloth so that the paste was enclosed, and then place this warm bundle onto the person's chest over their nightclothes, being careful that it was not too hot and checking frequently to make sure the skin was not becoming irritated. The mustard plaster would sit there for 15 or 20 minutes, and during this time the person would lie quietly in bed with pillows arranged behind them, and Martha would sit nearby in a chair, perhaps mending something or simply sitting with her hands folded in her lap, keeping watch and waiting for the appropriate amount of time to pass before removing the plaster and helping the person settle back down under the blankets. In the garden, during the growing season, Martha cultivated several plants that she considered useful for household remedies, and she would spend time in the early morning or in the evening when the sun was not so strong, moving slowly among the plants, examining their leaves and stems, pulling away any weeds that had appeared, and watering them gently with a watering can that she filled from the rain barrel that stood at the corner of the house. She grew chamomile, which produced small white flowers with yellow centers that looked like tiny daisies, and she would harvest these flowers when they were fully open, cutting them carefully with small scissors and placing them in a flat basket. And then she would spread them out on a clean cloth in a dry, shaded place where air could circulate around them, and over several days they would dry completely, becoming light and papery, and she would store them in a glass jar with a tight lid, and when someone needed a calming tea, she would take a small handful of the dried flowers and place them in a teapot and pour boiling water over them and let them steep. There was also a patch of lavender growing near the fence, and the lavender would bloom with purple-blue flowers that had a distinctive scent that seemed to carry on the breeze, and Martha would cut bunches of the lavender when it was in full bloom, tying the stems together with string and hanging them upside down from a beam in the attic, where they would dry slowly in the warm, still air. And once they were fully dried, she would strip the small flowers from the stems and store them in small cloth sachets that she placed in drawers and closets, and the gentle scent of lavender would permeate the linens and clothing, and sometimes she would tuck a small sachet under a pillow to help with sleep. Peppermint also grew in the garden, though it required some attention to prevent it from spreading too enthusiastically into areas where she did not want it, and Martha would harvest the peppermint leaves throughout the summer, cutting them with scissors and bringing them inside to make fresh tea. And the taste of peppermint tea made from freshly cut leaves was brighter and more lively than tea made from dried leaves, though both were perfectly good and served their purpose of providing something warm and soothing to drink. In addition to these plants, Martha grew a small amount of sage, which she used both in cooking and occasionally for making a tea that was said to be helpful for sore throats. And the sage had gray-green leaves that were soft to the touch, and she would dry these leaves in the same way that she dried the chamomile, spreading them out and turning them occasionally until they were crisp and ready to be stored away. Inside the house, Martha kept other supplies that were part of the household's approach to managing minor ailments and discomforts. And in a drawer in the kitchen, there was a hot water bottle made of thick rubber that could be filled with hot water from the kettle, and then wrapped in a towel and placed against an aching back or held against the stomach when someone had cramps or general discomfort, and the heat from the water bottle would seep through the towel and warm whatever part of the body it was pressed against. And this simple application of warmth was often sufficient to provide relief. There were also flannel cloths that were used for various purposes, including making compresses that could be dipped in warm water and applied to tired eyes or to areas of inflammation. And Martha would heat water on the stove until it was warm but not too hot, and she would dip the flannel into the water and wring it out so that it was damp but not dripping. And then she would fold it carefully and place it where it was needed, and the warmth and moisture would work together to provide comfort. When someone in the household had a cold, which happened from time to time, especially during the autumn and winter months when people spent more time indoors and the air was cold and dry, Martha would prepare simple remedies and focus primarily on keeping the person comfortable and encouraging them to rest. And rest seemed to be one of the most important things for recovery, along with drinking plenty of fluids and staying warm. She would make a pot of chicken broth using bones and vegetables that she simmered on the stove for several hours, and the broth would fill the house with a savory, comforting smell, and when it was ready, she would strain out the solids and serve the clear golden liquid in a cup or bowl. And the person who was unwell would sip it slowly, and the warmth of the broth would soothe their throat, and the nourishment would help their body in its work of healing. For a cough, Martha might prepare a simple syrup by dissolving sugar in hot water and adding a bit of lemon juice, if lemons were available. And she would give this syrup by the spoonful, and the sweetness would coat the throat and provide temporary relief from the tickling sensation that prompted coughing. And she would also ensure that the person's room had adequate moisture in the air, sometimes placing a pot of water on the stove or on the radiator so that steam would rise and add humidity to the dry indoor air. If someone had difficulty sleeping because of congestion, Martha would help them arrange their pillows so that they were lying at a slight angle rather than flat, and this adjustment would often make breathing easier and allow for better rest. And she would also make sure that they had a clean handkerchief within easy reach, and perhaps a glass of water on the bedside table. And she would check on them quietly during the night, moving softly through the house and opening the door just a little to see that they were resting comfortably. For minor cuts and scrapes, which were simply a part of life, especially for children who played outdoors and were always climbing and running and exploring, Martha would first clean the wound with plain water, allowing the water to run over the cut to wash away any dirt or debris. And she would pat the area dry with a clean cloth, being gentle so as not to cause additional discomfort. And then she would apply a small amount of iodine if the cut seemed at all significant, and the iodine would sting for just a moment, and she would acknowledge this to the person, telling them that it would only hurt briefly and that it was important for preventing infection. After the iodine had dried, she would cover the wound with a piece of clean bandaging, cutting the bandage to the appropriate size and securing it with small metal clips or by tying it if it was in a location where tying was practical. And she would tell the person to try to keep the bandage clean and dry. And she would change the bandage once a day, each time examining the wound to make sure that it was healing properly and showing no signs of redness or swelling that might indicate a problem. For burns from touching a hot stove or spilling hot liquid, which also happened from time to time despite everyone's best efforts to be careful, Martha would immediately place the burned area under cool running water and hold it there for several minutes. And this simple action of cooling the burn was the most important first step and after the area had been cooled, she would gently pat it dry and apply a thin layer of the zinc oxide ointment or petroleum jelly. And she would cover it loosely with a clean cloth, and she would watch carefully over the following days to ensure that the burn was healing and not showing signs of infection. For splinters, which were common when working with wood or spending time outdoors, Martha would first wash her hands thoroughly and then wash the area around the splinter. And she would use a needle that had been passed through a flame to sterilize it, allowing it to cool before using it to gently lift the skin near the splinter. And then she would use tweezers, also cleaned, to grasp the splinter and pull it out in the same direction it had entered. And once the splinter was removed, she would wash the area again and apply a bit of iodine, and usually that was all that was needed. Throughout the year, Martha would also prepare for the changing seasons by making sure that the household had what it might need. And, as summer turned to autumn, she would check her supplies of honey and make sure that there were lemons or lemon juice available. And she would harvest and dry the last of the herbs from the garden before the first frost came. And she would make sure that there was a good supply of flannel cloths and that the hot water bottle was in good condition without any leaks. In the winter, she would pay attention to everyone's skin, making sure that hands and faces were protected from the cold, dry air. And she would encourage everyone to wear gloves and scarves when they went outside. And when they came back inside, she would have them warm their hands gradually rather than putting them immediately near the heat of the stove. And she would apply petroleum jelly to any areas that seemed chapped or irritated. And she would make sure that there was plenty of warm soup and tea available. And she would keep the house at a comfortable temperature, neither too hot nor too cold. When spring came, Martha would begin to think about cleaning and airing out the house, and she would open windows on warm days to let fresh air circulate through the rooms. And she would wash curtains and linens, and she would take inventory of the medicine cabinet and dispose of anything that seemed old or questionable. And she would make a list of items to replace or replenish, and she would visit the general store or the pharmacy to obtain what was needed. The pharmacist in town was a man named Mr. Hendricks, and he worked in a shop that had a distinctive smell of various medicinal substances combined together. And the shop had shelves lined with bottles of different sizes and colors. And Mr. Hendricks would stand behind a high counter and would listen carefully when people described their symptoms or needs. And he would make suggestions about what might be helpful. And he would measure out powders or liquids and package them carefully in paper or bottles. And he would write instructions on labels in clear handwriting. And people in the town trusted him and appreciated his careful attention to their concerns. Martha would sometimes consult with Mr. Hendricks about various matters, and he would recommend certain preparations, and she would consider his recommendations carefully, weighing them against her own experience and knowledge. And she would make decisions about what to purchase and what to try. And over the years, she had developed a sense of what worked well for her household and what did not seem particularly effective, though she understood that different approaches might work for different people. There were also occasions when someone needed to see the doctor, and Martha was not hesitant about seeking medical attention when a situation seemed to warrant it. And the doctor in town was Dr. Patterson, who had practiced medicine for many years and who made house calls when necessary, arriving in his carriage with his medical bag. And he would examine the patient and ask questions and make recommendations, and Martha would follow his instructions carefully, administering any prescribed medications at the times and in the doses he had specified, and making sure that the patient followed his other recommendations about rest and diet and activity. But most of the time, most of the minor ailments and discomforts that arose in the course of daily life could be managed with simple measures, with cleanliness and common sense and the gentle application of basic remedies. And this approach seemed adequate for the ordinary bumps and scrapes and colds and stomach upsets that were simply part of being alive and going about one's daily activities. Martha's approach to household care was methodical and unhurried, and she believed that taking time to do things properly was important. And she did not rush through the task of preparing a compress or making a pot of tea or changing a bandage, but instead performed these tasks with attention and care, making sure that everything was as clean as it could be and that the person receiving care felt attended to and comfortable. In the evening, when the day's work was done and the house was quiet, Martha would sometimes sit in the kitchen with a cup of tea, and she would think about the day and about what might need to be done the next day. And she would look out the window at the darkening sky and at the garden where the plants were settling into their nighttime stillness, and she would feel a sense of calm satisfaction at having attended to the needs of her household in the small ways that were within her capability. The routine of caring for minor ailments and maintaining health was not dramatic or exciting, but it was steady and necessary, and it provided a structure to the days and weeks and seasons. And Martha found purpose in these quiet tasks, in keeping the medicine cabinet organized and stocked, in tending the herb garden, in knowing how to provide comfort when someone was unwell, in the simple gestures of care that connected her to her family and to the ongoing flow of daily life. She would go to bed knowing that tomorrow would bring its own small needs and tasks, and she would wake when the morning light came through the curtains, and she would pour water into the basin and begin again the quiet routines that made up the fabric of her days. And the medicine cabinet would be there beside the kitchen window, its glass door reflecting the light, its shelves holding their familiar contents, ready for whatever small need might arise. And the herbs in the garden would continue their slow growing, and the seasons would turn, and life would continue in its gentle, ordinary way, with each small action of care contributing to the larger work of maintaining comfort and well-being in the steady, unhurried rhythm of daily life. The hours would pass quietly, one after another, and in the house there would be the sounds of ordinary activities, footsteps on the floorboards, water running, the kettle beginning to heat on the stove, and outside the seasons would move through their cycles, and the herbs would grow and be harvested and grow again, and the medicine cabinet would remain in its place beside the window, and Martha would continue her careful tending, measuring and mixing and applying, folding cloths and filling bottles, checking and observing and adjusting, performing the small rituals of household care that required no audience and no recognition, but that formed the quiet foundation of comfort and health, day after day, season after season, in the slow and steady rhythm that needed no conclusion, because it simply continued, gentle and ongoing, like the breath of someone sleeping peacefully, like the gradual like the day, like the soft settle of sattva setup settling in to suppia to salad with the soda and maybe sapu and I you to agia I whip to up on I to papa I to to God that do you ka would do if you had to with the you guy moka will you would eat war if it would you take great but what if it was tight if that I did that with and you buff if it I walk there to the bed because that with